Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the mind.
The mind,
Yeah, how we understand it,
how it connects to the world.
how it connects to the world, and what makes those inner experiences,
So unique.
so unique. Yeah,
Yeah.
and we're going deep with Gregory McCulloch's book, The Life of the Mind.
And he's not just exploring his own ideas. He's drawing on thinkers like Descartes,
Oh wow.
Putnam,
Okay.
all sorts of people.
So it's like a greatest hits of
Yeah.
ideas about the mind.
Big thinkers.
I am here for it.
Yeah.
So McCulloch kicks things off with a question that's both ancient and totally relevant to us today.
Right.
How do we know our thoughts actually connect to the real world?
It's a question that's really plagued philosophers for centuries, and McCulloch uses a classic thought experiment to illustrate the dilemma.
Okay.
Imagine for a moment that there's a powerful demon out there
Okay.
whose sole purpose is to deceive us,
Uh-huh.
to make us think the world is different than it actually is.
Okay, so I think I'm holding a coffee cup, but the demon is tricking me, and it's actually a rubber duck.
Exactly. The demon could be manipulating our senses, making us see, hear, and feel things that aren't really there.
Oh, wow.
This scenario leads to two really, really tricky possibilities.
Okay, lay them on me. What are the horns of this demonic dilemma?
All right, so the first possibility is that our minds are completely separate from the world, locked away in some kind of inner realm.
So our thoughts are just these internal things floating around in our heads with no real connection to what's going on outside.
Right, but if that's the case, then how can we have thoughts about the world?
Mm.
How can our thoughts reach out and grasp onto things that are external?
Yeah, it'd be like trying to touch the moon
Yeah,
from your living room.
exactly.
Okay, I see the problem there, but what's the other option?
The other possibility is that the meaning of our thoughts is completely determined by the world, by the information our senses are feeding us.
So our minds are just mirrors, passively reflecting whatever's happening around us.
In a sense, yes. And if that's true, then what's left of our own subjective experience? What
Right.
makes our thoughts uniquely ours?
So we're stuck between a mind that's trapped inside itself and a mind that's basically a puppet of the external world.
Right.
And neither option seems particularly appealing.
Exactly. And this dilemma is something McCulloch grapples with throughout the book.
Okay.
He wants to find a way to understand how our minds can be both connected to the world
Yeah.
and yet capable of having their own independent existence.
Well, color me intrigued. So how does he start to untangle this knot?
He starts by looking at a concept called intentionality, which comes from the philosopher Brentano.
Yeah.
Brentano's big idea is that our thoughts are always about something.
Okay.
They're directed at objects.
Uh-huh.
Whether those objects are physical things, abstract concepts, or even fictional characters.
So even if I'm thinking about a unicorn which doesn't actually exist, my thought is still directed at something?
Exactly. There's a kind of mental arrow pointing from your thought to the unicorn, even though the unicorn is a product of your imagination.
Okay.
This directedness, this aboutness, is what Brentano called intentionality.
So intentionality is like a bridge between the inner world of our thoughts and the outer world of, well, everything else.
You could think of it that way, yes. But intentionality alone doesn't quite solve the puzzle.
Hmm.
We also need to consider what it feels like to have an experience.
Okay.
This is where phenomenology comes in.
And phenomenology, now there's a word that always sounds a bit intimidating.
Yeah.
Break it down for me.
Think of it this way. Right now, you might be feeling the warmth of your mug in your hands, or maybe you're hearing the traffic outside your window.
Okay.
These are all part of your experience. And phenomenology is about trying to describe what those experiences are like from your own first-person perspective.
So it's not just about the fact that I'm having an experience. It's about what it feels like to be me.
Yes.
Having this specific experience right now.
You got it. And McCulloch argues that to truly understand the mind, we need to understand both intentionality, how our thoughts are about things,
Right.
and phenomenology, what it's like to have those thoughts.
That makes sense. But
Yeah.
how does this get us any closer to solving that demon problem?
Yeah.
I mean, how do we know our thoughts about the world are actually accurate?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
McCulloch brings in another thought experiment this time from the philosopher Putnam.
Okay.
Picture a planet that's identical to Earth in every way except the liquid they call water has a different chemical composition.
Okay.
It looks and acts like our water, but it's not H2O. Let's call it twatter.
Okay. I'm picturing Twin Earth, a perfect duplicate,
Twinner.
except their water is quater.
Now imagine someone on Twinner says, I'm thirsty, I need some water. Are they talking about the same thing we are?
That's a good question. Their water looks and acts like water, but if it's not H2O, then I guess technically no.
Exactly, and this leads to a big idea called content externalism.
Okay.
Basically, the meaning of our thoughts isn't just in our heads. It depends on the world around us.
Okay.
So the meaning of water for someone on Twin Earth is tied to the specific substance in their world,
Right.
just like our meaning of water is tied to H2O.
So you're saying the stuff outside our brains actually helps shape the meaning of the stuff inside our brains.
Yeah.
That's a wild thought.
It is, and it raises a whole host of new questions. For example, if meaning is so dependent on the world,
Yeah.
does that mean our thoughts don't have any independent existence?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. If the world dictates meaning,
Right.
what's left of our own individual perspective? It feels like we're right back where we started with that second horn of the demon dilemma.
You're picking up on a really crucial point,
Okay.
and it's something McCulloch grapples with head-on. He doesn't shy away from the tough questions.
So how does he get us out of this philosophical pickle? Where do we go from here?
Well, he argues that we need to make a distinction between two different ways of knowing scientific knowledge and knowledge of the mind. They have different methods and different kinds of certainty.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this distinction.
In science, we aim for explanations that are objective and universally valid.
Right.
We do experiments, gather data, and look for patterns that hold true regardless of who's observing them.
Uh-huh.
But when it comes to understanding the mind,
Yeah.
it's more about interpretation.
Okay.
It's about understanding another person's unique perspective,
Hmm.
their way of experiencing the world.
So it's less about measuring and more about empathizing, getting inside someone else's head.
Precisely. McCulloch connects this to a fascinating idea from the philosopher Quine. Quine asked, how would we even begin to understand a completely alien language, one that has no connection to our own?
Oh, wow.
We'd have to rely on observing their behavior, trying to figure out the intentions behind their actions and the meanings behind their words.
So it's like trying to crack a code, but the code is a whole other way of thinking.
Exactly. And McCulloch suggests that understanding the mind is more like interpreting a story or a play than it is like performing a scientific experiment.
Yeah.
We're not just looking for objective facts about the brain. We're trying to grasp the subjective meaning that people create in their minds.
Okay, that's a really helpful analogy. So where do these vat brain thought experiments fit into all of this? It feels like we're about to jump into some seriously sci-fi territory.
You're right, we are. And the vat brain scenarios are where McCulloch really pushes us to the limits of our intuitions about the mind. He wants us to consider whether a disembodied brain could have genuine thoughts and experiences.
Okay, I'm ready to get mind-bending. Walk me through it.
All right, so imagine a brain just like yours or mine that's been removed from a body and placed in a vat of nutrients.
Okay.
It's hooked up to a super advanced computer that simulates all the sensory inputs the brain would normally receive from the real world.
So like the Matrix, but instead of a whole body, it's just the brain that's plugged in.
Precisely. Let's call this brain Vat Brain Taught 1.
Vat brain taught one.
Okay. McCulloch asks us to consider, could this vat brain have genuine thoughts and experiences about the simulated world it's interacting with?
Well, if it's receiving all the same sensory information, wouldn't it feel like it's living a real life, even if that life is just a computer program?
Yeah.
Thinking about this is really making me question what it means to have a real experience at all.
That's exactly what these thought experiments are designed to do, to make us question our assumptions.
Right.
And this is where the idea of interpretation comes back into play. Remember, McCulloch argues that to understand the mind, we need to be able to interpret it, to grasp the meaning behind its thoughts and actions.
Okay, so how do we interpret the thoughts of a vat brain? If it's thinking about simulated objects, simulated events, how do those thoughts connect to anything real?
That's the crux of the problem. Let's say both you and VatBrain.1 are looking at a cat.
Okay.
You're looking at an actual furry cat, and VatBrain.1 is experiencing a simulated cat generated by the computer program.
Right.
You both might have thoughts like, the cat is fluffy, or the cat is sitting on the mat.
But are those thoughts really about the same thing? I mean, my cat is a real living creature, while the vat brain's cat is just a bunch of pixels.
Exactly, and that's where the issue of intentionality gets really complicated.
Oh.
The vat brain's thoughts seem to lack the same kind of connection to the real world that our thoughts have.
So even if the vat brain is having some kind of subjective experience, it's an experience that's ultimately cut off from reality. It's like living in a dream world that has no connection to anything outside itself.
You could put it that way. Now, McCulloch doesn't give us a definitive answer to the question of whether vat brains are conscious.
Okay.
He uses these scenarios to explore the boundaries of our intuitions and force us to clarify what we really mean by consciousness.
So that's vat brain tot 1. What about the other scenarios that McCulloch describes? They get even weirder.
Oh, definitely. Let's move on to vat brain point 2.
Vat brain point 2, okay.
This time, picture a whole community of brains in vats, all hooked up to the same computer.
Right.
They can interact with each other, form relationships, even build a whole society within the computer program.
So kind of like a vat brain version of Second Life.
Exactly, but here's where it gets even more interesting. These vat brains can also interact with simulated versions of real people from the outside world.
Wait, so I could have a conversation with a vat brain version of myself,
Yeah.
and it would think it was the real me?
Potentially, yes. And that raises all sorts of questions about identity, the nature of self, and the boundaries between reality and simulation. I mean, how would you even know if you were talking to a real person or a simulated one?
Okay, now I'm really starting to see why philosophers love these vat brain scenarios.
Right.
They really do make you question everything. But even if we can't definitively say whether these vat brains are conscious, can we at least learn something from thinking about them?
Absolutely. One of the things McCulloch uses these thought experiments to do is to challenge the idea that consciousness is just about what's happening inside the brain.
Mm.
He argues that our physical bodies, our interactions with the world,
Right.
play a crucial role in shaping our mental lives.
So it's not just about the software, it's about the hardware too.
Precisely the way our senses interact with the world, the way our bodies move through space. All of that contributes to the richness and complexity of our conscious experience.
It makes you appreciate the simple fact of being embodied, of having a physical presence in the world.
Yeah.
It's not just about the information our brains are processing, it's about how we're actively engaged with our surroundings.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next vat brain scenario, vat brain point 3.
That brain point 3.
This one is particularly interesting because it blurs the lines between simulation and reality even further.
Okay.
Imagine a vat brain that exists in the real world,
Okay.
in a lab somewhere, but it's still receiving all of its sensory input from a computer simulation.
So it's in the real world, but its experiences are all virtual.
Right. But here's the twist. This brain's simulated world can overlap with the real world.
So the simulation could include elements of the actual world, like what if the simulation included a virtual replica of my apartment with my dog napping on the couch?
Exactly. And McCulloch uses this scenario to explore how our thoughts can be about things that aren't physically present. It makes us think about the way we're constantly simulating in our minds, remembering past experiences, imagining future scenarios, even having internal dialogues with ourselves.
It's true, so much of our mental lives is spent in a kind of virtual reality anyway. We're always constructing mental models of the world based on our memories, our beliefs, and our expectations.
Exactly. And vat brain point 3 helps us see how our mental simulations can sometimes feel just as real as our direct interactions with the world.
This is getting really meta. Okay, so we've got one more vat brain scenario, right? What's in store for us with vat brain point 4?
Vat brain point 4 adds a whole other layer of complexity in this scenario. We start with a person living a perfectly normal life in the real world,
Okay.
with all the usual thoughts, experiences, and memories.
Mm-hmm.
Then, through some elaborate surgical procedure, this person's brain is removed and placed in a vat connected to a computer, just like in the previous scenarios.
So it's like going from a fully embodied, world-engaged existence to a disembodied, simulated existence. It's almost like being born into a virtual world after living in the real one.
Exactly. And the question McCulloch raises is, can this vat brain, with its history of real-world experiences, still have genuine thoughts about the world, even though it's now cut off from direct sensory input?
That's a tough one. On one hand, you'd think its past experiences would still shape its thoughts and beliefs. But without ongoing feedback from the world, wouldn't those thoughts become increasingly detached from reality?
That's precisely the kind of philosophical puzzle McCulloch wants us to wrestle with.
Right.
And it highlights his main argument about embodiment, that our physical presence in the world is not just a nice to have, it's essential for the kind of meaningful, world-directed understanding that characterizes human thought.
So even if a computer could perfectly simulate all the sensory information of the world, it couldn't replicate the experience of actually being in the world, interacting with it directly through our senses and our bodies.
That's McCulloch's argument, and it's a powerful one.
Yeah.
It suggests that there's something about the lived embodied experience of being human that can't be reduced to just brain activity.
This is really making me think about how much we take our embodied experience for granted. The simple act of walking down the street, feeling the wind on my face, hearing the sounds of the city. It's not just sensory input. It's the foundation of our understanding of the world.
You put it perfectly, and these vat brain thought experiments, as strange as they might seem, really help us appreciate why that embodied experience is so vital to our mental lives. But we've explored a lot of complex ideas today, and I think it's time to step back and see how all of this connects to the bigger picture of McCulloch's argument.
I agree. We started with his demon dilemma, the problem of how our minds can be both connected to the world and yet have their own independent existence. How does McCulloch ultimately address this central question? Yeah, we started this whole deep dive with that demonic dilemma, how our minds connect to the world but also have their own unique existence. It's been a wild ride. So how does McCulloch finally tackle this head on?
Well, instead of offering like a simple solution, he proposes a more nuanced way of thinking about it.
Okay,
He calls it a tripartite view of meaning.
tripartite, 3 parts.
Yeah, 3 parts.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So basically, he's saying meaning isn't just determined by what's going on inside our heads or by what's happening in the outside world. It's this kind of dynamic interplay of 3 factors:
Yeah.
our internal mental states, our physical bodies, and the world around us.
So it's like a three-legged stool. You need all 3 legs for it to stand up.
Perfect analogy.
Okay.
And this tripartite view helps us see how our minds can be both grounded in the world and capable of generating their own unique subjective interpretations. It's not an either situation, it's a both-hand kind of thing.
That makes a lot more sense. It's not about our minds being trapped in a vat or being puppets of the world. It's about finding that sweet spot where inner and outer subjective and objective all come together to create the richness of human experience.
Exactly, and that's a key takeaway from McCulloch's work.
Right.
He's calling for a more holistic and embodied understanding of the mind.
Okay.
One that recognizes the complex interplay of internal and external factors that shape our thoughts, perceptions, and even our sense of self.
Yeah, I'm really starting to see how all these ideas fit together.
Right.
It's not just about abstract philosophical concepts. It's about understanding what it means to be human, to experience the world through our senses, and to make meaning of it all.
Absolutely. And thinking about the tripartite view of meaning raises some really interesting questions, especially as technology continues to evolve. For example, what does this mean for artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about this whole time. We have AI that can write poetry, compose music, even have conversations that are eerily human-like.
Yeah.
But if McCulloch is right, and our physical bodies and our interactions with the world are so essential to our mental lives, then could AI ever truly understand the meaning of what it's creating?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Could AI, even if it had access to all the information in the world and could process it at lightning speed, ever have the same kind of embodied world-directed understanding that we do?
Right, it might be able to mimic human thought processes, but would it ever be able to grasp meaning in the same way? Could it ever have the same kind of subjective lived experience?
McCulloch doesn't directly address the question of AI in the book,
Okay.
but his work definitely provides a new framework for thinking about the potential and the limitations of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I think this is something our listeners will be thinking about long after this deep dive. It's a question that raises all sorts of ethical and philosophical dilemmas.
It certainly does. And as AI becomes more integrated into our lives, it's a question that will only become more pressing.
Well, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of our journey into McCulloch's The Life of the Mind. It's been a deep dive, for sure. Hopefully you've come away with a renewed sense of wonder about how our minds work and how they connect us to the world around us.
And even though we've reached the end of this episode, the conversation doesn't have to stop here. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of the mind.
Absolutely. And until next time, keep those minds curious and those thoughts flowing. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.